Hey, I'm Lawson Reed, and for years I was the one opening the charity doors before dawn, sorting coats and heating cards for families who needed help. Then my own stepbrother accused me of stealing from that same charity, and just like that, the board, my family, everybody decided I was the kind of man who would take warmth from a child in winter. I almost walked away for good, until I realized it was never just a lie. It was a setup. Before we get into it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every comment. The cold always hit hardest before sunrise in Macon County. Not the dramatic kind. Just that damp Georgia chill that slipped through denim, sat in your joints, and stayed there until mid-morning. I pulled into the gravel lot beside Mercy Table Outreach while the church windows were still dark and the frost on my windshield had only half melted. My truck made that tired ticking sound old engines make after a short drive, and for a moment I just sat there with my hands on the wheel, looking at the red brick building that had taken more of my life than most people knew. Then I grabbed my keys and got to work. I did not have to look at the ring to find the right one. My thumb found the third key by feel, same as it had for years, and the metal door at the back of the storage room groaned upward with that familiar scraping sound. I heard that noise more often than I heard anyone say thank you. Inside, the air smelled like cardboard, laundry soap, and cold concrete. I flipped on the fluorescent lights and the whole room woke up in a flat white hum. Children's coats first. That was my habit. I checked the size tags against the intake sheet clipped to my board. A blue puffer for a boy in Pine Ridge whose sleeves had gone 2 inches too short by October. A red coat with one mitten tucked in the pocket for a little girl whose grandmother never asked for more than she absolutely had to. Then the blankets. Then the storage bins with thermal socks. Then the lockbox with the heating assistant's gift cards. Count, mark, close, move on. That was how the place stayed standing. Not from speeches, not from photos, from somebody showing up before daylight and making sure the promises on paper matched what people were actually going to receive. By 6:30, I had restacked a leaning pile of donated quilts, corrected 2 labels somebody had switched the day before, and set aside a grocery card I already knew I'd end up adding to Mrs. Dobbins' envelope, even though she'd insist one was enough. It never was. She just hated being seen needing help. A fresh donor appreciation poster was leaning against the wall near the fellowship hall door, waiting to be carried out for the winter fundraiser that weekend. I noticed it while I was moving a box of gloves. Khalil Mercer's name sat neat and bold under community leadership. Roni Bell was there. Devin Mercer, too. Mine was nowhere on the page. I did not stand there long. I had seen versions of that same thing before. Still, I let my eyes rest on the blank space where my name might have fit. Then I picked up the box and kept walking. A little later, while I was sorting scarves by size, a donor couple came in early with 2 bags of knitted hats. The husband looked at me, smiled politely, and said, "Morning. You mind telling Khalil we wanted to thank him for putting all this together?" I said. "I'll let him know." That was all. No lecture, no correction. Just another small thing folded up and placed where I kept all the others. The truth was, Khalil had been taking pieces of my work and wearing them like they were tailored for him for a while. A few weeks earlier at the Civic Hall fundraiser, he stood under soft lights with a microphone in his hand and told the story of a family Mercy Table had helped during last winter's freeze. He talked about driving through sleet. He talked about carrying blankets to a dark porch. He talked about keeping the heat on for people who had almost lost it. Every detail in that story had come from one night I made that drive myself. I remembered standing near the coffee urn with a carton of donated gloves against my hip, while people nodded at Khalil like he was the kind of man who carried hard things well. He smiled, lowered his head at just the right moment, and let the applause come to him clean. The door opened behind me, and I turned to see Patricia Burns step in with a folded paper bag tucked in the crook of her arm. "Morning, Lawson," she said. "Brought those scarves I told you about. Took me longer than I meant to. These old fingers like to argue with me." I took the bag from her and peeked inside. Hand knit. Careful work. "These are beautiful, Patricia." She waved that away. "Well, if that key ring of yours ever goes quiet, half this county will feel it before noon." I laughed a little at that, but she meant it. That was the thing about Patricia. She had a way of saying simple truths, like she was only making conversation. My phone buzzed while I was setting her scarves aside. A text from my mother. "Don't forget Devin and Khalil will be at the donor dinner tonight. Let's just keep everything smooth, honey. Nothing sharp in it, nothing anyone else would find wrong." But I had heard that tone my whole life. Stay useful. Stay calm. Do not make a moment harder than it already is. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without answering. By the time the sky outside had gone from black to that dim gray just before morning properly arrives, I had the side room locked, the intake forms clipped in order, and the first round of winter aid set for distribution. I stood for one more second in front of that donor poster, then headed toward the main hall where the public face of Mercy table would be put together by people who never seemed to arrive early enough to see how the place actually ran. I belonged to that work more deeply than I belonged to most things in my life. And somewhere in the next room, someone else was already practicing how to own the story of it. What I did not understand yet was that taking my place in the room was only the first thing he wanted. By late afternoon, the frost was gone from the church lot, but the air still had that thin winter bite that made everybody walk a little faster from their trucks to the civic hall. I spent most of the hour before the fundraiser carrying folding tables in through the side entrance, straightening the winter aid display, and checking the donor cards one last time against the envelopes stacked in a plastic bin. By then, the room already looked the way small-town events always do when people want them to feel nicer than they really are. White tablecloths, store-bought centerpieces dressed up with ribbon, pound cake in neat slices, church ladies whispering over coffee urns like they were coordinating a state dinner. Khalil was already near the front. He had his jacket off, sleeves folded clean at the wrist, coffee in one hand, the other moving easy through the air while he talked to a donor couple from Fort Valley. He always knew how to angle himself toward money, attention, and approval all at once. Some men never look more alive than when they know people are watching. Khalil was one of them. I was carrying in the last display board when I heard him say, "We're finally getting this place where it can sustain real leadership." He said it with that smooth half smile of his, like nobody in the room should feel threatened by the sentence. Then he saw me, shifted without missing a beat, and added, "Lawson keeps the wheels turning. I'm just trying to help us think bigger." That was the trick with him. He knew how to insult you in a way that left everyone else admiring his manners. A little while later, when more people had filtered in and the room was warm with voices, he took a donor packet off the registration table. I had put it together that morning with sponsorship sheets, the winter distribution summary, and a short note about heating assistance requests climbing earlier than usual. He flipped through it, pulled out my summary page, and slid Roni's printed welcome letter to the top. Then he handed it to Chase Ellery like he had assembled it himself. I watched that happen from 6 feet away. Chase took the packet and glanced at me before he looked back at Khalil. "You all expecting a rough winter?" "We're preparing for one," Khalil said. "That's leadership, right? Seeing the need before it hits the door." I set down the extra chairs I'd been carrying and said, "Did you include the updated utility request totals? They came in this morning." Khalil turned to me with that patient look he liked to use when he wanted other people to think I was being fussy. "I thought we were keeping it high level tonight." "Donors usually like the numbers when they're writing checks," I said. Chase looked down into the packet again. "He's right about that." Khalil laughed softly, like we were all on the same side, but I could see the irritation settle at the corners of his mouth. Later, just before Roni stepped up to welcome everybody, Khalil rearranged the speaking order without saying a word to me. I was supposed to give the short logistics update on winter distribution. Instead, he moved himself between Roni and the donor acknowledgments and waved me off with, "I'll cover the essentials. No need to bog folks down." No need to bog folks down. That was how he translated my work into something small enough to stand on. He did it again about 20 minutes later, right in front of Chase. Khalil rested his hand on my shoulder and said, "Lawson is great with the back-end side. He keeps the warehouse world from falling apart. I handle more of the people-facing part." It sounded harmless, even generous if you didn't know better. But there I was, reduced to shelves and clipboards, while he stood in the warm light talking about mission and community trust like he'd built both with his bare hands. Across the room, my mother smiled too quickly when Devin nodded along to one of Khalil's remarks. Devin liked a man who spoke well in public. My mother liked anything that kept a room smooth. Nobody asked whether I had eaten. Nobody asked how long I'd been there. I was close enough to lift what needed lifting and far enough away not to matter in the pictures. Still, not everybody in that hall was blind. Near the dessert table, Alicia Crow stopped me before I headed back toward the supply bins. "I caught that label switch before it went out," she said quietly. "Only because you fixed the others earlier." I told her that was what I was there for. She gave me a strange little look and said almost under her breath, You always know where everything is before anybody else even realizes it's missing. I did not think much of the line then. I remembered it later. By the time the crowd thinned and the paper plates were stacked in the trash, Khalil was still inside laughing with Roni and two late-staying donors. I was out in the lot loading leftover display boards into my truck under the floodlights, my hands cold from carrying metal stands and plastic bins. That was when Chase came out. He stood beside my tailgate for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, looking back toward the hall where Khalil's voice kept floating through the open door. Then he said, "Funny how the folks who talk most about keeping a thing running are rarely the ones out here, stacking chairs after." I shut the tailgate and looked at him. He gave a short nod toward the building. "He talks like he built this thing. You and I both know he didn't." I did not answer right away. I just glanced through the Civic Hall windows, where Khalil was still standing in the middle of the room like he belonged at the center of everything worth noticing. One man was visible, the other was necessary. And 2 mornings later, when I unlocked the storage room and saw what was missing, I knew the cold outside was not the thing that had turned on me. The trouble with being the one who knew every shelf, every tote, every clip form, was that I could feel when a room had shifted before I had proof that it had. 2 mornings after the fundraiser, I unlocked the storage room and knew something was wrong before I could have said why. It was still early. The concrete floor held the night cold. My breath was faint in the light from the overhead fixtures. I stood there with the key ring still in my hand and looked at the coat rack first. Not because I had counted it in my sleep, though some winters it felt close to that. It was because one side sat lighter than it should have. The spacing was off. I set my clipboard down and walked over. 3 children's coats were gone. Not donated odds and ends nobody had claimed. New ones. Tagged, logged, assigned. One of them was meant for a little girl out on Miller Road whose grandmother had called twice asking whether we had anything warm enough for the school bus line. I checked the thermal boot tote next. 2 pairs missing there. Then the lockbox. The heating cards were short by 4. I did not panic. That probably sounds strange. But panic is for people who do not know the system. My first instinct was to assume I had missed something. I opened the lockbox again, counted once, counted twice. Then I pulled my notebook closer and checked the tally I had made after the fundraiser. I turned back 2 pages, checked the handwritten intake list, then the loadout log, then the emergency note sheet I kept tucked behind the clip. Same result every time. I tried to walk myself back through the last 48 hours. Had I moved those coats and failed to mark them? Had Wendy updated a family packet and not told me? Had Morgan asked me to hold boots aside for a late pickup and I trusted myself to remember it later? I checked each thought the way you check a gate more than once in bad weather, hoping the problem is only that you did not latch it right the first time. It was not that. By the time Morgan Pike came in through the side door, I had the lockbox open, 2 clipboards spread out, and the boot tote tipped on its side. She stopped when she saw my face. "What happened?" "The count is off," I said. 3 coats, 2 pairs of boots, 4 heating cards. She did not answer right away. She looked at the folding table, then the rack, then at me again. Morgan had depended on me more than once to catch mistakes before Roni ever saw them. I had fixed duplicate family files for her, corrected bad labels, even covered a missed delivery without making a thing of it. That morning all she said was, "Maybe it'll turn out to be nothing." Maybe, but she did not stay to recount with me. That was the first turn. Small enough that nobody else would have noticed it. Big enough that I did. Word moved through the building the way it always does in places like that. Quiet at first. A door half open. A lowered voice. A pause in conversation when somebody came through. A younger volunteer named Becca, who usually teased me about my handwriting looking like an old pharmacist, stepped into the doorway, saw the papers spread out, and left without saying a word. Wendy came in 10 minutes later and spoke to me in that careful tone people use when they are already thinking ahead of the facts. "You want me to tell Roni there's a discrepancy?" "A discrepancy," I said. "Tell her the count doesn't match, and I'm still checking." Wendy nodded, but I could feel the distance in her before she even turned away. Then Alicia Crow leaned into the intake room and said one sentence that made everything worse. "That family from Miller Road called again. They were asking whether the winter boxes got delayed. They thought the coats were coming this morning. So now it was not only a count problem, it had faces. A girl waiting on a coat. A boy walking to the bus in cold shoes. Somebody choosing whether to run the heat another day. I took pictures of the rack, the tote, the lockbox, the count sheets. I circled the missing line items in my notebook and copied the loadout signatures onto a clean page. I was not building a case yet. Not in my own mind, anyway. I was doing what a careful man does when the ground starts giving under him. I was making sure memory would have somewhere to stand later. Around midday, I stepped into the hall outside the office and saw Khalil with Roni near the copier. They were talking low. Both of them stopped when I came through. That by itself did not prove anything. But Khalil's face did something that stayed with me. He looked concerned too fast. Not surprised, not confused, concerned like he had already chosen the expression before I reached them. "What's going on?" he asked. I looked at him for a second longer than usual. "Still figuring that out." Roni said, "Let's not jump to conclusions." I had not jumped anywhere. I was still standing in the place where the numbers stopped making sense. The rest of the day stretched out under those fluorescent lights. People came and went, the building emptied, the cold pushed harder against the walls by late afternoon. I counted again after everyone left, slower this time. Same shortage, same sick feeling settling lower every hour. By the time I locked the storage room, the gravel lot was nearly empty, and the key ring felt heavier than it ever had. I stood there with my hand on the metal handle and understood something I did not want to name yet. When something goes wrong, people do not always stand beside the one who carried the weight. Sometimes they step back and wait to see whether that weight will crush him first. By the next evening, the missing coats were no longer just missing coats. They had become a story, and somehow I was already standing in the middle of it. The first thing Khalil stole from me was not my good name. It was the handful of quiet hours when the missing coats and cards might still have been handled like a problem instead of turned into a story. Roni called the meeting for the following evening and said it would be brief. "Just a review," she told me over the phone. "We need clarity before this gets any bigger." The way she said bigger told me it already had. By the time I walked through the fellowship hall and into the side room off the kitchen, I could feel the shape of it before anyone opened their mouth. Bridget Sloan had papers lined up too neatly in front of her. Roni sat too straight. The coffee on the side table had gone lukewarm, but nobody looked comfortable enough to pour any. Devin was there, which told me this was no ordinary inventory conversation, and my mother stood near the back wall with both hands around a paper cup like she needed something to hold besides her nerve. Khalil looked ready. That was the part I remember most clearly. Not angry, not rattled, ready. He had that careful look people wear when they want credit for doing something ugly for the good of everyone. Roni started with board language. "We've got a serious discrepancy," she said, "and before rumors start, we need to establish what happened." Before rumors start. I almost laughed at that, because in a county our size, rumors never waited for permission. She glanced at Khalil. That was all he needed. He leaned forward, folded his hands, and let out a breath like this burden had been placed on him against his will. "I checked the count twice," he said. "I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation." Then he laid the items out one by one. 3 children's coats, 2 pairs of insulated boots, 4 heating cards. He let each one settle in the room before he looked at me. "These weren't extras," he said. "These were already promised." That line was deliberate. He wanted everybody picturing cold kids and worried grandparents before he got to the part where my name would fit into it. Then he said it. "You were the last one with access. Not you took them. Not I know you did it. Just enough for everybody else to finish the sentence in their own heads." I looked right at him and said, "Then say it plainly. Don't dress it up as concern." Nobody came to my side. That was the moment that stayed with me long after the rest of it. Not the accusation itself. The speed of the surrender. Nobody said, "Lawson, that doesn't sound like you." Nobody said, "Let's slow this down." Nobody brought up the fact that I'd spent years opening that building in the dark and making sure people got what was promised to them. Instead, Bridget asked, "Were there any off-the-books emergency distributions?" Roni followed with, "Have you ever removed items temporarily before entering them later?" Even the questions had guilt baked into them. I turned toward my mother. I did not need a speech. I just needed one look that said she remembered who I was. She would not meet my eyes. She stared into that cup like there might be an answer at the bottom of it. Khalil shook his head softly, like all of this disappointed him. "Nobody wants this to be true, Lawson, but things don't just walk away." That one almost got me, not because it was clever, but because it was cruel in such a common way. He talked to me like I was forcing him into honesty. I said, You really want to do this in front of them? He gave me that wounded look liars use when they think calmness makes them righteous. I'm trying to protect the charity. There it was, the magic phrase. Protect the charity, protect the mission, protect the donors, protect everyone and everything except the person in the room they were willing to stain. I looked at Devin then. How are you even entertaining this? He answered in the same tone men use when they've already decided what they'll call reasonable. If you didn't do it, the truth will come out. But right now, the organization has to come first. I felt that one lower than anger, because it told me everything. My innocence was now secondary to appearances. My years of keeping that place running meant less than one evening of bad optics. And my own family was willing to call that practical. Kenya finally looked up, but only for a second. Too late. Too thin. Nothing in it I could stand on. The room was no longer asking whether the coats and cards were gone. The room was deciding whether I was the kind of man they could imagine doing it. And from the way they sat there with their careful voices and tidy questions, the answer was yes. I did not stay much longer after that. There was no point. Once people start speaking to you like a liability, the conversation is already over whether they admit it or not. On my way out, I passed the bulletin board in the fellowship hall. A fresh flyer for the winter campaign was pinned there. Bright colors, smiling faces. Mercy Table's logo at the top. Khalil stood in the center of the photo from the fundraiser, hand half raised, looking like the sort of man who had built something generous. I wasn't in the picture at all. I stood there for 1 second too long and understood something I wish I had learned years earlier. I had been missing from their version of the story long before they ever accused me inside it. What came after the accusation was somehow worse than the accusation itself because it arrived dressed up as procedure. What came after that meeting was somehow harder to stand in than the accusation itself because nobody had to raise their voice to do damage. By the next morning, they were no longer deciding whether they trusted me. They were deciding how much of me they needed to remove. I got to Mercy Table earlier than usual, not because I expected fairness, but because I was not about to give anybody the satisfaction of saying I stayed home out of guilt. The office lights were already on when I crossed the gravel lot. That told me enough before I ever opened the door. Roni was in the front office. Bridget sat with a legal pad in front of her. Wendy stood by the printer, shuffling papers in that brisk, harmless-looking way some people have when they are doing something cruel and calling it administration. On the table sat a manila envelope in a printed access sheet. My name was on it, but only in the way a thing gets listed once it has already been decided. Roni folded her hands. Lawson, this is temporary. Pending review, we need you to step back from operations so there's no confusion. No confusion, Wendy added. I already adjusted the volunteer schedule. Already. Bridget asked whether I had any handwritten backup records at home they might need. Devin stood near the door, saying very little, which somehow made the whole thing worse. His silence gave it the feel of family approval. Like this had passed through the right hands before it reached me. Then Roni said, "We'll need your storage keys." That landed harder than I expected. I reached into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around the ring for a second before I pulled it out. Those keys had opened that place before dawn in rain, frost, power outages, and more mornings than I cared to count. I set them on the table carefully, but the sound of metal touching wood still cut across the room, sharper than anything anybody had said. Nobody moved right away. I looked at all of them and asked the only thing that mattered. So after all these years, this is really that easy to believe? Not one person gave me a straight answer. Roni looked down. Bridget straightened a stack of forms that did not need straightening. Wendy touched the edge of the printer tray. Devin shifted his weight and said, "This isn't personal." That was almost enough to make me laugh. It was entirely personal. I took the envelope Roni slid toward me and walked out before I said something I would regret. The air outside had that wet gray chill that settles over everything before noon in winter. I sat in my truck and turned the key halfway so the heater could cough to life. Then I opened Mercy Table's website on my phone. My name was already gone. The contact page had been updated. The volunteer coordinator line no longer listed me. The winter delivery calendar I built was still there, but my pickup slots had been replaced with other names. I checked the shared email out of habit. Access denied. It is a strange feeling, seeing yourself erased in real time. A text came in while I was still staring at the screen. It was from a donor I'd known for years. "I couldn't find your name on the site. Did you step down?" That one hurt worse than the meeting. Because by then I could see the speed of it. The lie did not even need to finish hardening before the replacement version of me was already being sent out into the world. A little later, my phone buzzed again. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice came through soft, careful, exhausted. "I know this is painful, honey. Maybe taking a little space will let things calm down. Let everybody breathe." That was what she had for me. Not "I know you," not "this is wrong," just another request to carry the comfort of everybody else. I sat there with the voicemail still open and finally understood something I should have learned long before that morning. Being useful is not the same as being valued. I drove home around midday, tossed the manila envelope onto the kitchen table, and stood there without opening it for a long while. My house was quiet in the kind of way that makes a man hear every bad compromise he ever made with himself. I started thinking maybe the easiest thing left to do was nothing. Let them have the building, the schedules, the smiling pictures, the donor language. Let them all discover in their own time what they had traded away. By late afternoon, I was back in the truck again, parked across from the church lot without going in. I do not know exactly why. Habit, maybe. Or maybe I wanted to see whether the place looked any different without me in it. It didn't. That was the part that nearly finished me. For the first time, Mercy Table looked like a place that could survive by pretending I had never been part of it at all. I sat in the darkening cab with my phone screen black in my hand, my reflection faint in it, and wondered whether the quietest thing I could do now was leave them all to their own collapse. By that night, I was close enough to walking away that one more lie might have finished me for good. What stopped me was not strength, not anger, and not even hope at first. It was one voice that still remembered who I had been before the rest of them started working so hard to decide who I must be. I sat in my kitchen a long time that night with the board's envelope still unopened beside my elbow. My jacket was draped over the chair where I had dropped it. The house had that hollow kind of silence that makes every small sound feel personal. The refrigerator clicked on. A truck passed out on the county road. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and quit. I kept telling myself I ought to open the envelope, sort the papers I still had, answer my mother's voicemail, do something useful. Instead, I stared at the wall and thought about all the ways I had helped build the story they were now using against me. I had let Khalil speak for Mercy Table because I thought keeping the peace mattered more than getting credit. I had swallowed little insults because grown men were supposed to know when not to make a scene. I had spent years proving my worth through work, and somehow that had trained everybody around me to see my labor as ordinary and my silence as permission. At some point, I opened my laptop. I pulled up the folder where I kept backup counts, old inventory notes, delivery logs I had scanned because small charities lose paper the way old houses lose heat. I looked at that folder for a long time. Then I moved the cursor toward delete. That was how close I was. Not to giving up on the truth, to giving up on the effort of being the only person left who seemed to care about it. My phone rang before I clicked. Patricia Burns. I nearly let it go. Then I answered because ignoring Patricia would have felt like stepping away from the last decent thing still facing me straight. "Lawson," she said in that calm voice of hers. "You at home?" "I am." "Good, because I need you to listen to me a minute." I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. She did not give me pity. She did not give me drama. She gave me something much harder to turn away from. "I know what kind of man you are," she said. "People do not spend years carrying winter to other folks' porches and then turn around and steal it back." That sat in me deeper than I was ready for. Then she added, and I remembered something I should have said sooner. "Come by if you can." The drive out to Patricia's place took about 15 minutes if you caught the lights right, a little longer on a cold night when the truck took its time warming up. Her porch lamp was on when I turned in. Yellow light through thin curtains, a little wreath hanging crooked on the door. It looked like a house where people were still allowed to be human. She met me in slippers and a wool cardigan, waved me inside, and set a plate of leftover cornbread on the table, like feeding a man was part of clearing his mind. There was tea already steeping. No performance, no careful tone, no, "I'm sorry you're going through this." Just a place to sit and a cup pushed toward me. After a minute, she said, "2 evenings before all this started, I brought over those hats and scarves after regular hours. Remember?" I nodded. "Well, Khalil's SUV was parked behind the storage room." She folded her hands around her mug. That caught my eye because he had no business being there then. And when he came around the side door, he was carrying donor folders. Looked startled to see me too. Said he was just getting ahead on outreach paperwork. I did not say anything right away. Patricia went on. The side light was already on. Building sounded open. I didn't think much of it at the time. Then at that fundraiser, he made some remark about this winter drive, finally putting the right people in the right seats. I remember thinking it was an odd way to talk. I looked down at the table. It was not proof. Not the kind you could slam down in front of a board and be done with. But it was a seam, a place where the lie no longer sat flat. More than that, it told me I was not imagining the wrongness of it. I was not some wounded fool trying to make order out of insult. Something had been off before the accusation ever touched my name. Patricia watched me for a second and said, "Softer now. You think disappearing would make you the decent one in this. It would only make them comfortable." That one got through, because she was right. Walking away would not make me noble. It would make me useful to them one last time. I stayed another 20 minutes, finished the tea, thanked her for the cornbread, and drove home slower than I had driven out. The road was still dark, but it no longer felt empty in the same way. Back in my kitchen, I opened the envelope from the board. Then I opened the laptop again. I pulled the backup files back up, spread old count sheets across the table, and dug duplicate notes out of the drawer where I had half a mind to bury them. Finally, I took a legal pad, wrote one line across the top, and underlined it. What they needed me to be guilty for. That changed the whole shape of it. I was no longer asking how they could believe something so ugly about me. I was asking why that version of me had become useful to so many people all at once. The house stayed quiet around me, but it did not feel hollow anymore. I was not back because they deserved my effort. I was back because the truth did. Once I stopped asking how they could believe it and started asking why they needed to, the whole thing changed shape. What I found next was worse than plain theft, because theft would have been simpler than the lie they had built around my name. The next 2 days, my kitchen table stopped being a kitchen table. It turned into a workbench. I spread out count sheets, old delivery logs, screenshots from my phone, donor notes, and the copy of the inventory adjustment Roni had leaned on in that meeting. I lined them up the way I used to line up winter requests by county road and family size. When you have touched every stage of a system long enough, patterns speak before people do. 3 documents bothered me most: my handwritten tally from before the winter push, the typed adjustment sheet used to raise concern about the missing items, and the volunteer distribution log Wendy updated after I was pulled out. The sequence was wrong. Too polished in one place, too sloppy in another. The official trail looked clean where it should have shown wear, and messy where our process had always been simple. I kept hearing Patricia's voice in my head. The side light was already on. Khalil came around the building carrying donor folders. He looked startled to see her. By then, I was not only thinking about the coats and cards, I was thinking about timing. A few weeks earlier, Roni and Khalil had started using the same phrases over and over: future-facing growth, professional leadership, donor confidence. At the time, I had chalked it up to fundraiser talk. Sitting there at my table, I remembered something else. Khalil had not been chasing visibility alone. He had been moving toward authority. That got confirmed around noon the next day. Chase Ellery called while I was out in the parking lot at the supply store on my lunch break. He did not waste words. "You ever hear about that paid outreach position they were floating?" My grip tightened on the phone. "No." There was a short silence on his end. "Then you should have. Draft proposal made the rounds with 2 donors. Director of Community Outreach, contingent on winter expansion money." I looked out across the lot at a line of pickup trucks and dirty windshields and felt something in me go very still. "And Khalil?" I asked. Chase gave a dry little breath. He was talking like the seat already had his shape in it. That was the hinge. I was not the problem they were solving. I was the obstacle they needed gone. Back at home that evening, I went through the forms again with that in mind. Which version of the count sheet had been in use that week? Which notation code Wendy switched to later in the month? Which volunteers had access to the lockbox? Who handled donor cards before distribution? And who only logged them after pickup? Then I found it. The adjustment sheet that helped turn suspicion toward me used the revised line code format Wendy had not introduced until after the date printed on the page. It was small, easy to miss. Not enough by itself to clear me, but it was enough to tell me somebody had touched the paper trail after the fact. The harder proof came the following morning. Chase met me outside his office and handed me a copy of a donor ledger entry he said I probably ought to see. One of the heating cards had a partial card number attached to it in the winter packet summary. Chase had asked an innocent question about tax reporting and followed the trail farther than anyone expected him to. The card had been used all right, just not for heat. It had been run at a sporting goods store outside Warner Robins. I stared at the receipt copy for a long moment. Store name, timestamp, last 4 digits. Real enough to hold in your hand. After days of being smeared by implication, I finally had something with corners. I was not relieved. I was angry in a colder way than before, because this told me the lie had been built to survive a first look. Not brilliant, just careful. Careful enough for people who preferred appearances over process. The pressure did not ease while I worked. If anything, it tightened. Roni had started reaching out to donors with soft language about internal challenges and protecting the mission. Khalil posted something vague online about hard leadership decisions and betrayal from where you least expected. Morgan still would not say what she knew out loud. She had that cautious, half-withdrawn look of somebody who could feel the floor shifting and still hoped silence might keep her clean. That was what made the whole thing so dangerous. If I stayed quiet, Khalil's version would harden into memory. If I spoke, I would be the man dragging a charity and his own family into open shame. There was no painless road left. Only one that let me keep what was left of my name. By the last hour of daylight, I stopped caring whether anybody apologized. That part was over. What I wanted now was narrower than forgiveness and stronger than vindication. I wanted the lie pinned down so tightly it could not outlive me. So I built the sequence I meant to carry into that room. Patricia's memory on one page, the form discrepancy on another, the receipt from the sporting goods store beside the donor ledger, the timeline of when the proposal for the paid role had started circling, Khalil's access, Roni's pressure, my removal. Then I wrote one sentence at the top of my legal pad and circled it until the paper nearly tore. They did not accuse me because the evidence pointed to me. They accused me because I was the easiest person to bury before anyone checked. By the time I walked into that meeting, I knew 2 things for certain. I had the truth, and Khalil was not done trying to bury me with one last lie. I thought the hard part would be proving what happened. I was wrong. The harder part was laying the truth out in a room full of people who still wanted a version of the story that would let them keep their hands clean. The emergency meeting started just before dark. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot, the annex windows were already glowing that tired yellow church buildings get in the evening. Trucks lined one side, older sedans the other. I carried in one plain file box. Nothing dramatic, no performance, just papers, copies, notes, and the few things I had left that could still stand up on their own. The room looked almost exactly the way it had the night they first turned on me. Same folding chairs, same narrow table, same stale coffee smell. Roni had my key ring sitting off to one side beside her folder, as if it belonged to the meeting now more than it had ever belonged to me. Khalil sat close to her. Devin was there, stiff in the shoulders, looking like a man who wanted a problem solved more than a wound understood. My mother looked worn out in a way that might have moved me once. It didn't now. I sat down last. When Roni started speaking, I cut in before she could frame me again. "I'm not here to ask for trust," I said. "I'm here because records were altered, donor aid was misused, and my name was used to cover both." That changed the air. Not enough, but some. I began with sequence, my original count sheets, my backup tally, dates in my handwriting. Then the adjustment form they had leaned on to justify suspicion. I laid the copy flat and pointed to the line code format. "That notation wasn't in use on the date printed here," I said. "Wendy changed that system later." Wendy's face changed first. Just a flicker, but I caught it. Then I moved to the heating card trail. I handed Chase's copy across the table. One of the cards supposedly missing under my control was used at a sporting goods store outside Warner Robins. That is not emergency utility assistance. Bridget took the page and stared at it longer than she wanted to. Next came Patricia's account. Not as a grand witness, just a simple, ugly fact. Khalil had been at the building after hours, near the storage room, carrying donor folders, during the exact stretch of time he later pretended to know nothing about. Then I tied in the draft role proposal. Director of Community Outreach, paid if the winter expansion money came through. I looked at Khalil then. This was not about missing coats. It was about clearing a lane. For the first time all evening, the room leaned my way. That was when Khalil made his move. He pulled a copied inventory sheet from his folder, along with a grainy still image, in a printout of an old text I'd sent weeks earlier. I didn't want to do this, he said, which was exactly why I knew he had been waiting to do it. But if we're talking about altered narratives, let's talk about all of them. He slid the papers forward. The image showed a figure near the storage area beside a truck. The text read, "I'll take care of those boxes myself." Khalil spread his hands. Lawson handled things off hours all the time, outside normal process. Now he wants everybody to accept his word over a messy paper trail. The room shifted. I felt it. Chase looked down again. Devon's jaw tightened. Roni straightened like she had found the ground under her feet one more time. A weaker man would have tried to defend his character. I almost did. Then I stopped. Yes, I said. I handled off-hours problems sometimes. Everybody in this room knows why. Because when people needed heat after 5 o'clock, somebody still had to answer. That took some of the shine off Khalil's trap. Then I pointed at the copied form he had just offered up. The notation code on this page still wasn't in use on that date. So either time changed for all of us, or somebody touched this paperwork later. I tapped the blurry image next. And that picture doesn't place me where you say it does. That evening I was across town on a scheduled pickup. The delivery receipt is in the box. Time-stamped? Then the text. Those boxes were coat donations tied to Wendy's calendar. Scheduled. Logged. Not private removals. I let that sit for a second. Then I asked the only question that mattered. How did Khalil end up with selected internal materials, copied and arranged in a way that only makes sense if he had his hands on them before the complaint was ever formally escalated? Nobody answered. That was the break. This was no longer about whether I looked imperfect under pressure. It was about who had shaped the pressure in the first place. Bridget was the first to crack. Roni, were these copies made before the board review? Roni started talking about incomplete context and misunderstandings. Devon turned and looked at Khalil with something colder than disappointment. My mother finally understood the shape of what had happened, and I could see it in her face. Too late, but clear. Khalil opened his mouth again, maybe to soften it, maybe to turn it into confusion instead of intent. I didn't give him the room. You didn't lose me tonight, I said. You lost me the day this sounded believable to you. I wasn't talking only to him. That landed where it needed to. Nobody stopped me when I stood up. Nobody tried to hand me a title, or an apology, or some patched-up version of belonging. The truth was in the room now. It could sit with them. I picked up my box and walked out without touching the keys. By the end of that night, clearing my name was no longer the hardest part. The hardest part was standing there while the people who failed me started talking like I was supposed to help them survive what they had done. There was a time I would have picked those keys up without thinking, just to keep the place from falling apart. That was before I learned the difference between being needed and being loved. The room did not break all at once after I said what I needed to say. It came apart the way old wood does under too much weather. Quietly first, then all at once in the wrong places. Roni started talking about review, procedure, next steps, as if better wording could put the air back in the room. Bridget kept shuffling papers she was no longer reading. Devon called my name in a voice I had wanted years ago and did not want anymore. Lawson, wait. I turned, file box still in my hand. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. You know how to steady this thing. That was the insult hiding inside the apology. When they thought I was guilty, I was a threat. Now that the truth had teeth, suddenly I was the man they could not do without. Roni slid the key ring across the table toward me. We should correct this immediately, she said. Restore your access. Put things back where they belong. I looked at the keys for a long moment. They had once meant responsibility. Then they became humiliation. Now they were a test. Those keys used to mean trust, I said. Nobody answered that. My mother stepped closer, her voice thin from crying. I don't know how to fix this, honey, but please don't let everything fall apart. There it was again. Not I should have believed you. Not I failed you. Just one more request for me to carry what everybody else had broken. I set the file box down long enough to look at her properly. My name was never the problem. What you were willing to believe about it was. That one landed harder than anything else I said that night. I left before they could turn regret into a job offer. The next morning, Macon County was already doing what small places do. Truth moved faster than official statements when enough people had seen the room tilt. By lunchtime, folks at the feed store had quit looking at me like a question mark. By the weekend, Everybody knew the proposed outreach role had been frozen, donor review money was on hold, and Khalil was no longer being spoken about like the future of anything. He did not vanish in some dramatic blaze. It was colder than that. Chase told me funding conversations had stopped taking his calls. Roni faced a formal review. Bridget had to answer for process failures she had waved through. Devin, from what I heard, stopped defending Khalil altogether. No shouting, no public exile, just distance. In a place like ours, that kind of silence can finish a reputation quicker than noise. A few days later, I drove past Mercy Table on my way to Patricia's. I slowed at the corner and looked at the building without pulling in. I could still love what that place was meant to be. I just could not go back inside it as the man who made everybody comfortable while they forgot what he was worth. Patricia met me on her porch with 2 mugs and did not say a word about winning. She handed me one, looked out over the field and said, "You kept yourself." That was better than most apologies. Over the next couple of weeks, I put the papers in order, closed the folders, and stopped checking whether Mercy Table had corrected the website. They probably did. They may even have put my name back where it had been missing. By then, it no longer mattered. Fairness does not repair what betrayal damages. Being proven right does not give you back the moment people chose the wrong version of you. But a man can still walk away with his name, his clarity, and the part of himself they never managed to own. One cold morning near the end of the month, I loaded my pickup with 2 boxes of canned goods, a stack of blankets, and a bag of children's gloves Patricia had gathered from neighbors. Not through Mercy Table, just through people who still knew what help was supposed to look like. The road ahead of me was narrow and quiet. The sun had only just started lifting over the fields. I was still the man who showed up. I had simply stopped showing up where I was only valued in crisis.